Sorry, not sorry to make another video on Nick Shirley's disinformation MAGA propaganda video that has gone super viral about Minnesota daycare centers. Go back and watch the video before this one if you want all of the full context, or if you still are one of the people who thinks that Nick Shirley said anything factual in his absolute bullshit video. I want to focus here on what I think is one of the best analyses of Nick's video, and not just his video, but all of the context surrounding it, because I think we're going to see a lot more right-wing disinformation propaganda popping up everywhere. All kinds of young bro influencers who think that they're going to be the next Charlie Kirk, or really they think they're going to be the next Tyler Oliveira. All of these little boys who think that they are going to get really big and rich and famous by pivoting from their prankster, immature YouTube videos to covering right-wing talking points. I mean, there's an awful lot of money to be made in the right-wing media grifter ecosystem. You don't even really have to be taking dark money from Russia or Republican-run PACs or what have you, even though I recognize a lot of these bros do. And none of us are naive enough to think that these boys are real independent journalists and that there's not dark money, there's not foreign money, there's not Republican money driving that they're not being fed subject matter and talking points. There's this great Substack called Weaponized, and they had a piece out entitled Nick Shirley's Somali Daycare Fraud Video is Bullshit. Here's Why It Worked Anyway. It's by Caroline Bueno, PhD. I really encourage you to go read the whole Substack because it breaks down all of the disinformation tactics that Nick Shirley and guys like him use and what we can do about it. Dr. Bueno discusses how Shirley utilized the element of controlling the core narrative, right? He put out the initial narrative and that put everybody else on the defensive. It's much harder to try and debunk something that people already believe. It's much harder to debunk an established narrative than it is to come in and set that narrative in the first place. And I think so often people on the political left are constantly on the back foot. We're constantly trying to debunk and correct misinformation, which is a much heavier lift, a much harder job. And MAGA is really good at coming in and setting a false narrative. People cement that in their brains, they believe it, and then, you get people who are radicalized for the alt-right. You get people who will stubbornly cling to Nick Shirley's narrative or to any MAGA propaganda. They are resistant to your efforts to debunk it. Article goes on to talk about Nick Shirley's selective editing. One example is where he showed up at a daycare center and was like, see, nobody's here. He went there after hours. Right, so he could say there are no children inside this building, and he's not lying to you. He just went there at a time when no children were going to be present anyway. Those are just a couple of the multiple propaganda techniques that Shirley employs. Another one that the author discusses is credibility laundering, and this is something we see from right-wing media repeatedly. It's sort of the same way that Donald Trump and his regime are, as Jamel Bouie likes to call them, cargo cult fascists. All of the trappings, all of the rituals of actual fascism, but they're certainly not Vladimir Putin. It's just sort of play acting. It's going through the motions of fascism. That's why Donald Trump is so bad at it. It's the same thing here. It's the aesthetics of journalism. It's the semblance, like, oh, I'm doing these interviews. I'm framing things. I'm setting up my shots, and I'm using the cadence of my voice in a way that makes it sound like I'm an investigative journalist. As the author says here, it borrows the visual language of journalism, but without having to adhere to journalistic standards. I mean, honestly, we could talk about how that's not unique to propaganda on the right. That happens when people claim that they're independent journalists on the left as well. Dr. Bueno says there is no transparent methodology, no clear sourcing hierarchy, no meaningful right of reply, and no proportionality in the video coverage. Yet to many viewers, the aesthetic of investigative journalism substitutes for the substance. This part here, in-group versus out-group appeals, one of the most consequential and least explicitly acknowledged tactics in Shirley's video is its reliance on in-group appeals to frame the alleged misconduct as a moral violation against everyday Americans, rather than as a narrow policy or oversight issue. Exactly. The Minnesota Republicans who fed Nick Shirley this information are really good at setting up the in-group versus the out-group for him, right? It's all of us, the American people, versus these corrupt, bad, exploitive Somali foreigners, right? It's setting up that dynamic. As the author goes on to say, it's no longer just illegal behavior. Again, these daycare centers have not been accused of illegal behavior, the ones mentioned in the videos. It becomes a symbolic theft from the moral community. The framing activates grievance politics, even among viewers who might otherwise support public child care funding or social programs. Right, the author goes on to talk about how this in-group, out-group framing, it cuts off people's ability to access empathy. MAGA propaganda is really good about taking like one discrete issue, in this case, supposedly about daycare fraud, and ballooning it into a much greater issue. An issue about morality and righteousness, an issue about attack on Americans. And that makes it so easy for them to use this appeal to folks' emotions rather than having to rely on any evidence, because there isn't any evidence. You don't have to manipulate data if they can manipulate your emotions. A great way to manipulate your emotions is to rely on your pre-existing bias, your racism, your fears about government wasting money. In fact, I saw a right-wing propaganda page on Facebook that spews just like awful nationalist, isolationist, racist shit. Post like a huge screed about government fraud, waste, and abuse, and how we have to have hearings, we have to make sure that our taxpayer dollars are not being wasted. And I was like, bro, you're so close to class consciousness. You're so close to understanding what the Trump regime is doing. But there's no concern for the billions and billions of our taxpayer dollars that are being sent to Elon Musk and Starlink and Peter Thiel, that are going to Oracle, that are going to fucking Grok, right? Like there's none of that concern. It's all about feeling like this sense of moral outrage. The taxpayer dollars may have been wasted on Somali immigrants supposedly committing fraud. Like he's so close to getting it. And I think that's one way that we're seeing the kind of righteous outrage that conservative working class Americans have over the fact that we are being exploited. Our tax dollars are being wasted in America. We are oppressed by the oligarchy. It's taking all of that rage and once again scapegoating it onto a vulnerable population. This is a tactic that MAGA has used with great success for election cycle after election cycle. I also really appreciated that the author addresses what disinformation is. Disinformation doesn't mean fake. More often than not, disinformation looks like what we see here. Real footage, real money, real places, real people. The label of disinformation gets applied because of the way the footage is strung together, the choices that were made about what to include and not to include, and the content and style of the narration. Disinformation is not defined by falsity alone. It is also defined by intent and effect. When real facts are stripped of their context, assembled to imply a conclusion that isn't supported by the evidence presented, and targeted at reinforcing stereotypes or political narratives, the result is a materially false understanding of reality. Woo! If that does not sum up MAGA, right, this adds yet another layer that makes it even more complex for us to debunk the disinformation that MAGA puts out. This article does such a brilliant job of using Nick's video in particular to examine the way that MAGA puts together propaganda and convinces millions of Americans to believe in absolute bullshit lies. But then there's the bigger picture. Why is it that we are failing so hard to combat all of this propaganda? And we've been failing for many years. And what can we do about it? What do we need to do differently? I appreciated that the author talks about the ways that like traditional media is just completely ill-equipped to handle disinformation. They're not set up that way. And it reminds me of how like the Constitution is not really set up to deal with a reality where we have people in all three branches of government who are committed to dismantling democracy so that no checks and balances work. Our founding fathers did not anticipate this scenario where Republicans in Congress would just lay down and not do their job. So there's no framework for handling that. Likewise, it kind of breaks the brain of legacy media to deal with just straight up disinformation. Maybe that's part of why they've struggled for so long with this desire to sane wash and platform Donald Trump and far right-wing politicians, trying to make it seem like they need both sides, both opposing sides in any panel discussion, when one side is just like way out here and the other one is like a very reasoned, data-informed, data-driven position. The author concludes by discussing how we have to move from defense to preemption. And this is something I've really struggled with all this year, how we are constantly defending democracy. We're defending against MAGA. And like, when do we go on the offense? Publishing fact checks and counter narratives isn't going to do it. We have to get ahead of the story. We have to drive the narrative, a narrative based in truth. We have to get good at building compelling narratives, telling good stories. Likewise, we have to be exposing the tactics that folks like Nick Shirley use. How is it that we get the political left to get off the back foot and get on the offense? Because that's the only way we're going to deal with the flood of propaganda that's going to be coming out from the right as we head into the midterms.